The galaxy hums with 1,000 stories, but tonight it will hum with only yours. A story not of princes or heroes, but of the life lived behind white armor, the quiet and lonely path of a stormtrooper. It begins simply, with a soft glow of stars spilling across the dusty streets of your childhood world, where Imperial banners hang above market stalls and the crackle of holoscreens fills the air with speeches about order, safety, and the glory of service. As a child, you listen to those words and believe them because belief is easier than doubt, and because the soldiers who march in their endless rows seem untouchable, shining, perfect in their sameness. You remember the first time you stood at the edge of a plaza, craning your neck as the garrison marched past, helmets reflecting the light like mirrors, boots striking in rhythm like the heartbeat of the Empire itself. The crowd cheered, but you did not cheer. You stared wide-eyed at the mystery of those faceless figures, wondering who they were, and if someday you might be one of them. You grew up among rations and shortages, where work was hard and meals were plain, where your family spoke in hushed tones about things you were too young to understand, but you felt the hunger for something more, a place to belong, a uniform to wear, a life that seemed larger than your own. And then came the recruiter, tall in his pressed uniform, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, promising opportunity, food, pay, a future where you would serve not just yourself, but the Emperor. He did not mention the silence inside the helmet, the long nights in cold barracks, or the way the galaxy would fear you rather than thank you. He spoke only of honor, and honor sounded sweet. So you packed your bag, just a few belongings, leaving behind the home you knew, watching the stars blur through the viewport of a transport bound for an academy you had never heard of. Somewhere deep inside, you told yourself you would be different, that you would matter, that you would stand taller than the rest. But the Empire does not raise individuals. It raises soldiers. The first time you held the helmet, its weight surprised you, heavy and solid, colder than you expected. When you lowered it over your head, the world narrowed to a slit of vision, and the air filled with static and the hollow echo of your own breath. In that moment, you ceased to be only a boy or a girl with a past. You became one of millions, faceless, nameless, a piece of something vast and unstoppable. The helmet silenced not only your voice, but your doubts, reminding you that from now on, orders would matter more than questions, loyalty more than dreams. And yet, even as the helmet closed around you, a small flicker of self remained, fragile as starlight, hidden behind the mask. You did not know then how many battles would come, how many worlds you would march across, or how many comrades you would lose in the dust of war. You did not know that people would curse your presence, that children would hide from the white glare of your armor, that rebels would fight not against you but against what you represented. All you knew was the promise of belonging and the sound of boots in perfect rhythm and the dream that you were part of something eternal. The helmet awaited you and you accepted it, not yet realizing that in its silence you would lose your face, your name, and perhaps even yourself. And so your story begins, not with victory or defeat, but with a quiet breath inside a helmet, the moment when you step across the line from child to soldier, from dreamer to shadow. The galaxy will not remember you, but tonight we will, as we follow the life lived behind that mask, the life of a stormtrooper. You were born in the shadow of banners that had already been raised, in a galaxy that had already decided your place long before you could walk. And though you never thought of yourself as different, you would learn quickly that to be a child of the Empire was to grow with its weight pressing softly but firmly on your shoulders. Your earliest memories are not of freedom, but of order. Streets swept clean beneath the watchful eyes of patrols, hollow screens crackling in every square, with speeches about prosperity and peace, and the sight of stormtroopers in perfect white lines, faceless and identical, their presence so constant that they seemed as natural as the sky above you. You lived on a modest world far from the gleaming core, a place of dust and markets, of ships that came and went but never lingered, where families worked long hours to meet quotas and ration cards were counted carefully at the end of each month. Your parents were quiet people, dutiful, respectful of the system, grateful for what stability the Empire offered. Yet you could feel the weariness in their voices at night when the work was done and the lights dimmed, their whispered conversations heavy with concerns they never fully shared with you. As a child, however, you noticed only the surface, the parades that filled the plazas on Imperial Day, where officers in gleaming black marched proudly and speeches promised a brighter future. The sight of stormtroopers disembarking from transports, their armor gleaming in the sun, their movements synchronized as though they were a single body. The way other children stared at them with awe, whispering about their strength and bravery. In your small world, the troopers were heroes, guardians who kept smugglers away and enforced curfews so the nights were quiet. And though fear lingered at the edges, it was hidden beneath the banners and the songs that told you the Empire meant safety. You went to school in buildings where Imperial symbols hung above every classroom, where officers in gleaming black marched proudly and speeches promised a brighter future. The sight of stormtroopers disembarking from transports, their armor gleaming in the sun, their movements synchronized as though they were a single body. The way other children stared at them with awe, whispering about their strength and bravery. In your small world, the troopers were heroes, guardians who kept smugglers away and enforced curfews so the nights were quiet. And though fear lingered at the edges, it was hidden beneath the banners and the songs that told you the Empire meant safety. You went to school in buildings where Imperial symbols hung above every classroom, where lessons spoke not of ancient Jedi knights, but of traitors who had betrayed the Republic, where you learned to write the Emperor's name before you learned the stories of your own people. The holovids between lessons showed Star Destroyers gliding across the stars, their might unmatched, their presence a reminder that the Empire stretched everywhere, protecting every citizen, punishing every dissenter. You learned to count with numbers painted on blaster rifles, to read with phrases drawn from propaganda slogans, to speak with phrases like, "Order brings peace and the Emperor protects." At first it was only words, games, chants repeated in unison, that you came home speaking of order and loyalty, proud that you dreamed of a future where you could serve. They never told you not to, never warned you of what was hidden behind the banners, perhaps because they were afraid, perhaps because they too believed that service was the only path left for children like you. At night, when the power dimmed and the streets fell silent, you would lie awake staring at the ceiling of your small room, hearing the faint echo of stormtrooper boots as patrols passed outside, and you would imagine yourself among them, tall and strong, armor gleaming, helmet sealed, part of a story bigger than your own. The galaxy was vast, the stars unreachable, but the Empire stretched across them all, and you believed that one day you would stretch across them too. Childhood passed with this rhythm. Mornings of study, afternoons of chores, evenings of patrols moving quietly under street lamps, days marked by propaganda broadcasts, weeks marked by ration distributions, years marked by the annual parade where the banners rose and the troopers marched again. You did not notice the things your parents noticed, the shortages that grew worse, the whispers of smugglers bringing news of rebellion, the way neighbors vanished and were never spoken of again. You only noticed the Empire's presence, constant and immovable, a backdrop to every moment of your young life. And so you grew, shaped not by choice, but by the silence of inevitability, a child molded by the rhythm of order, never yet realizing that the path you walked was already narrowing, leading toward the academy gates, toward the armor, toward the helmet that even then seemed to wait for you at the end of the corridor of your youth. You were a child of the Empire, and though you still laughed, still dreamed, still wondered at the stars, your life was already tethered, your future already written, even if you could not yet see the ink dot. And as the years stretched onward, the world you called home became less a place of wonder and more a stage upon which the Empire rehearsed its power. For even in the smallest details of your childhood, the mark of the regime was present, guiding your thoughts, shaping your hopes, and teaching you to see duty as destiny. At school, history lessons painted the Jedi as liars who had betrayed the galaxy, and every hull of it reinforced the idea that chaos had ruled before the Emperor's reign, that only his hand had brought calm, that without his order, the galaxy would collapse into fire. In the plazas, when you watched the Stormtroopers march, you no longer saw them only as mysterious figures, but as a future to aspire to. Believing their faceless unity was strength, that their silence was noble, that their sacrifice was glorious. The adults around you did not contradict these stories, though sometimes you caught unease in their eyes. Sometimes you overheard fragments of conversations about ration cuts, about neighbors who had spoken too loudly and then disappeared, about smugglers whispering of battles far away that the Empire never reported. But as a child you accepted the surface because the surface was safer and because the Empire had already perfected the art of teaching its young to look forward rather than question. When the recruiters came, setting up their stands in the square, handing out pamphlets with shining images of stormtroopers standing tall against a backdrop of endless stars, your heart leapt with excitement rather than fear. They spoke of security, of honor, of serving something larger than yourself. And though you were too young then to enlist, you already felt the pull, already imagined the day when you would walk onto a transport and leave behind your small life for the grandeur of the Imperial cause. At home, your parents did not discourage this dream, for even if they feared it, they also knew the truth. The Empire offered little choice to families like yours. When the recruiters came, setting up their stands in the square, handing out pamphlets with shining images of stormtroopers standing tall against a backdrop of endless stars, your heart leapt with excitement rather than fear. They spoke of security, of honor, of serving something larger than yourself. And though you were too young then to enlist, you already felt the pull, already imagined the day when you would walk onto a transport and leave behind your small life for the grandeur of the Imperial cause. At home, your parents did not discourage this dream, for even if they feared it, they also knew the truth. The Empire offered little choice to families like yours. Opportunities were scarce, advancement rare, and the uniform was one of the only ways for a child to escape the weight of poverty. And so they allowed you to dream, even encouraged it, proud when you recited Imperial creeds, proud when you stood straighter than your peers in parades, proud when you said you wanted to serve. And though you did not know it then, though you still laughed with friends in alleys, still dreamed of ships and distant worlds, your path was already narrowing. The Empire had no need of your individuality, no space for your childish wonders. It wanted only your obedience, your body, your life. The helmet was waiting, silent, patient, inevitable. The day the recruiter arrived is etched into your memory not because of anything he said, but because of the way the entire town seemed to hold its breath as his shuttle descended, its polished hull gleaming with the emblem of the Empire, its shadows stretching long across the square where the market stalls usually bustled with chatter. Vendors hushed their voices, families gathered quietly at the edges, and you, standing small among the crowd, felt as though the moment had been waiting for you your entire life. When the shuttle's ramp lowered, a man in a black uniform strode down. Crisp lines pressed into his tunic, boots that shone like mirrors, and a voice that carried like a broadcast when he greeted the people. He did not need to shout. The weight of his presence was enough to command silence. Behind him stood a pair of Stormtroopers, their armor spotless, their rifles slung casually but menacingly, and you could not help but stare at them, at their helmets, at the way their breath hissed faintly through vocoders, as if reminding you of what you might one day become. The recruiter's speech was carefully woven, words that slid easily into your ears, promising a life larger than the one you knew. He spoke of the Empire's glory, of the peace that only discipline could bring, of the chance to rise above the dust and ration lines, to wear the armor of guardians who stood against the chaos that threatened the stars. He did not speak of war or death, not of the weight of orders or the loss of self. He painted a picture of service as belonging, of service as honor, of service as the surest way to give your life meaning. Families nodded, some with pride, some with quiet resignation, for they knew as well as you that the galaxy offered few other futures for children born far from the core. And when his eyes swept across the crowd, they seemed to linger on you. Though perhaps that was only your imagination, the part of you that already longed to step forward, to volunteer, to take your place. After the speech came the holovids, projected against the square's old walls, endless lines of stormtroopers marching in unison, star destroyers gliding like mountains through the sky, children like you transformed into soldiers of the Emperor, their heads held high as they received helmets and rifles, their futures shining as bright as the banners that waved behind them. You watched, heart racing, imagining yourself among them, imagining the pride in your parents' eyes, the thrill of stepping into that endless formation. He spoke of the Empire's glory, of the peace that only discipline could bring, of the chance to rise above the dust and ration lines, to wear the armor of guardians who stood against the chaos that threatened the stars. He did not speak of war or death, not of the weight of orders or the loss of self. He painted a picture of service as belonging, of service as honor, of service as the surest way to give your life meaning. Families nodded, some with pride, some with quiet resignation, for they knew as well as you that the galaxy offered few other futures for children born far from the core. And when his eyes swept across the crowd, they seemed to linger on you. That the Emperor rewards loyalty, that you would soon be part of something eternal. And in that moment, standing beneath the banners, beneath the gaze of stormtroopers and citizens alike, you felt the first stirrings of transformation. The recruiter's promise was not of truth, but of inevitability. And you, still a child, believed every word, not knowing that what awaited you was not honor, but silence, not individuality, but obedience, not freedom, but a helmet that would one day take even your face from you. But you smiled, because all you could see was the promise of belonging, the chance to escape the smallness of your world, the dream that the Empire's path was your destiny. And so the promise was sealed, and the journey began. That night, after the recruiter's speech had faded into echoes and the holovids had been shut down, you sat in your small room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls, staring at the few possessions you had gathered into a bag, a worn datapad with childish games, a keepsake from your parents, a jacket too small for you now but familiar enough to feel like home. The recruiter's words still lingered in your ears, a chorus of belonging and pride, and though doubt stirred in the quiet, it was drowned beneath the certainty that you were leaving, that tomorrow you would walk onto the shuttle and step into the future, promised. And so the promise was sealed, and the journey began. That night, after the recruiter's speech had faded into echoes and the holovids had been shut down, you sat in your small room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls, staring at the few possessions you had gathered into a bag, a worn datapad with childish games, a keepsake from your parents, a jacket too small for you now but familiar enough to feel like home. The recruiter's words still lingered in your ears, a chorus of belonging and pride, and though doubt stirred in the quiet, it was drowned beneath the certainty that you were leaving, that tomorrow you would walk onto the shuttle and step into the future, promised. And so the promise was sealed, and the journey began. That night, after the recruiter's speech had faded into echoes and the holovids had been shut down, you sat in your small room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls, staring at the few possessions you had gathered into a bag, a worn datapad with childish games, a keepsake from your parents, a jacket too small for you now but familiar enough to feel like home. The recruiter's words still lingered in your ears, a chorus of belonging and pride, and though doubt stirred in the quiet, it was drowned beneath the certainty that you were leaving, that tomorrow you would walk onto the shuttle and step into the future, promised. Knew such things would be taken from you soon enough. Still, you closed your fingers around it, feeling its shape against your palm as you walked up the ramp and into the belly of the ship. Inside, rows of metal benches lined the walls, and you sat among other recruits, boys and girls your age, all of you quiet, all of you staring at one another with nervous curiosity, as if trying to see in each other's faces the future you had been promised. The stormtroopers stood watch at the front, silent, their visors blank, their presence a reminder of what you would become. When the ramp closed and the shuttle lifted, you felt the ground of your childhood fall away beneath you, your world shrinking into memory as stars began to pierce the viewport, stretching into lines as the ship leapt into hyperspace. A hush fell over the cabin, not the hush of comfort, but of surrender. And you realized then that you were no longer a child of your homeworld, no longer your parents' son or daughter. You are now a recruit, a piece of the Empire's machine, carried toward a destiny shaped not by choice, but by promise. And yet, even as the engines roared, and the stars blurred. You held the token in your hand and told yourself you would remember. That no matter how many promises the recruiter made, no matter how heavy the helmet became, there was still something in you that belonged only to you. The shuttle's descent into the academy was like the drawing of a curtain, the familiar stars of your childhood giving way to steel, discipline, and the cold embrace of order. For when the ramp lowered, you were met not with the warmth of home, but with the sharp chill of a world designed only to forge soldiers. The sky above was gray, the air heavy with the scent of ozone from endless training blasters and drills, and the ground stretched into courtyards of Duracrete, lined with barracks as identical as the soldiers who marched between them. Officers in black uniforms barked orders the moment your boots touched the landing pad, their voices stripped of kindness, their eyes measuring you not as a person, but as material to be shaped. And within moments, you and the others were herded into lines, numbers shouted, belongings confiscated, names taken and replaced with designations that felt hollow in your mouth. You clutched the small token your father had pressed into your palm, but it was pulled from you and tossed into a bin with the other remnants of childhood. Family pictures, worn trinkets, scraps of memory that had no place behind the academy's walls. In the dormitories, you were given a cot, a thin blanket, and a locker with your new number etched into its side. And as you lay awake that first night, listening to the muffled sobs of other recruits and the heavy footsteps of patrols outside, you realized you had already begun to disappear, your old self dissolving into a sea of white sheets and whispered fears. Mornings came early, long before dawn, the sound of sirens tearing through the cold, dragging you from restless sleep into the relentless rhythm of training. You marched in straight lines through narrow corridors until your feet ached, stood in formation until your legs trembled, and when you faltered, you were struck with a flat of a baton or the sting of a shouted rebuke, your shame magnified by the silence of those around you. Meals were ration packs eaten quickly in mess halls, echoing with orders rather than laughter, and every moment outside of sleep was filled with drills, lessons, and propaganda holos that replayed the same messages you had heard as a child. The Jedi are traitors. The Emperor is eternal. The Stormtrooper is the shield of the Empire. At first the helmet was strange, the plastoid pressing against your temples, the breath loud and mechanical in your ears, the world narrowed to a visor's slit, but with time it became normal. So normal that to remove it felt like exposure, a baton, or the sting of a shouted rebuke, your shame magnified by the silence of those around you. Meals were ration packs eaten quickly in mess halls, echoing with orders rather than laughter, and every moment outside of sleep was filled with drills, lessons, and propaganda holos that replayed the same messages you had heard as a child. The Jedi are traitors. The Emperor is eternal. The Stormtrooper is the shield of the Empire. At first the helmet was strange, the plastoid pressing against your temples, the breath loud and mechanical in your ears, the world narrowed to a visor's slit, but with time it became normal, so normal that to remove it felt like exposure, as though your face was a weakness best hidden away. Slowly, individuality dissolved. The boy or girl who had stepped onto the shuttle grew quieter, smaller, until all that mattered was moving in rhythm, obeying the command, silencing the voice within. And yet, beneath the drills and the exhaustion, Bonds began to form with those beside you. Comrades who shared the same bruises, the same hunger, the same fear. In whispers after lights out, you shared fragments of yourselves, stolen pieces of humanity that the Academy could not fully erase. And though you no longer had names, you learned to recognize one another in gestures, in tones, in the rare flicker of humor that survived the weight of discipline. Everything else. Dark days inside the Academy stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, until time itself became another drill. A pattern of marches, lessons, punishments, and exhaustion so regular that you no longer thought of the days you had left behind, only of the hours you needed to endure before the next order was given. The walls of the compound became your horizon, gray and unyielding. And beyond them, you could see little but the storm clouds that seemed to gather endlessly over the training grounds, as though even the weather conspired to keep you looking inward, not outward. Weapons training began quickly, your hands clumsy at first as you struggled with the weight of an E11 blaster rifle. Its cold metal pressing into your shoulder as instructors barked corrections. You learned to strip it down and reassemble it until your fingers could do the work in darkness, until your body remembered what your mind no longer needed to think. The first time you fired it, the recoil jolted through your arm, the bolt searing a mark across the target, and though the sound rang harsh and unforgiving in your ears, something inside you whispered that you had taken another step into the shape the Empire wanted for you. Squad exercises followed, endless hours of moving in formation, learning to breathe, aim, and march as one, until the line of troopers beside you blurred into a single body. Its cold metal pressing into your shoulder as instructors barked corrections. You learned to strip it down and reassemble it until your fingers could do the work in darkness, until your body remembered what your mind no longer needed to think. The first time you fired it, the recoil jolted through your arm, the bolt searing a mark across the target, and though the sound rang harsh and unforgiving in your ears, something inside you whispered that you had taken another step into the shape the Empire wanted for you. Squad exercises followed, endless hours of moving in formation, learning to breathe, aim, and march as one, until the line of troopers beside you blurred into a single body. Your individuality replaced with the discipline of unity. Failure was punished swiftly. Extra drills in the rain, push-ups until your muscles trembled, confinement in the cold silence of the detention block, and soon you learned not to falter, not to question, not to hesitate. Even your thoughts seemed to change, bending toward the rhythm of the chants you were made to repeat. Loyalty is strength. Obedience is order. The Empire is eternal. At first you muttered them with reluctance, but over time the words slipped from your lips without effort, ingrained as deeply as breathing, until you no longer noticed the strangeness of their echo in your own voice. Its cold metal pressing into your shoulder as instructors barked corrections. You learned to strip it down and reassemble it until your fingers could do the work in darkness, until your body remembered what your mind no longer needed to think. The first time you fired it, the recoil jolted through your arm, the bolt searing a mark across the target, and though the sound rang harsh and unforgiving in your ears, something inside you whispered that you had taken another step into the shape the Empire wanted for you. Squad exercises followed, endless hours of moving in formation, learning to breathe, aim, and march as one, until the line of troopers beside you blurred into a single body. Yourself as someone who chose, but as someone who obeyed. And though the process was harsh, even cruel, it was delivered with such steady precision that you began to mistake it for truth. Each dawn arrived before your body was ready, sirens cutting through uneasy dreams, boots slamming against cold floors as you and the others scrambled into formation, eyes still heavy, hearts still pounding, but never daring to move too slow, never daring to speak out of turn. Instructors stalked the lines with eyes sharp as vibroblades, their voices hard as durasteel, barking orders that left no room for hesitation. One misstep from a single recruit meant punishment for the entire squad, and soon you learned to police one another, to shout down the weak, to pull along those who stumbled, for unity was survival and failure meant pain. Days were filled with obstacle courses designed not only to test strength, but to break it. Walls that scraped your hands raw, mud that swallowed your boots, electric shocks that jolted your body if you lagged behind. Nights were filled with lessons that drilled tactics into your mind: how to flank, how to surround, how to crush resistance with overwhelming firepower, until maps and formations danced behind your eyelids when you tried to sleep. You were taught to march in storms, to crawl through freezing water, to carry comrades on your back when they fell, every exercise forcing you deeper into the identity of a soldier. And though exhaustion wrapped around you like chains, something else grew alongside it: the first flickers of pride. When you completed a drill without faltering, when your squad moved in perfect rhythm, when your blaster shots struck the target dead center, the instructors gave the smallest nods, and those nods felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Slowly, the bruises, the hunger, the aching muscles became badges rather than burdens, proof that you were becoming what the Empire wanted you to be. The old self, the child who had once stared at parades in awe, began to fade, replaced by someone who stood straighter, someone who no longer thought of comfort, but of completion, someone who began to believe that strength was not just demanded, but deserved. In the silence of the barracks after lights out, when whispers died away and only the hum of the bass remained, you would close your eyes and picture yourself in gleaming armor, marching not as one among recruits, but as one among troopers, a perfect part of the endless whole. And though you told yourself you would remember who you were beneath the helmet, the voice inside grew fainter with each passing day, until discipline was no longer something outside pressing in, but something inside pressing outward, shaping you from within. As the months unfolded, discipline seeped into every part of you until it no longer felt like something taught, but something that defined the rhythm of your heartbeat, and the academy seemed less a prison and more the only world that had ever existed. You rose before dawn not because the siren demanded it, but because your body anticipated the call, snapping awake at the first flicker of light. Meals were no longer hurried rations, but timed drills of efficiency, every bite measured, every motion made without waste, for even in eating you were taught to serve. Survival exercises pushed you further than you imagined possible. Dropped into wilderness with only a knife and a canteen, you learned to drink rainwater, to build fires from scrap, to march until your legs numbed with pain, the instructors watching from a distance, marking those who endured and those who faltered. Instructors spoke less of loyalty now and more of instinct, hammering into you that hesitation kills, that mercy is weakness, that the only true bond is to the squad and to the Empire. In the evenings, Psychological drills replaced lectures. Hypnotic propaganda vids played until your eyes blurred, voices whispering that you were chosen, that the Empire gave you purpose, that rebels were parasites gnawing at the galaxy's bones. The repetition wore you down, and soon even your private thoughts echoed with slogans. And yet, amidst the exhaustion and the endless drills, a strange transformation took root. When your squad maneuvered across the training field in flawless synchronization, you felt something close to joy, a pride not in yourself, but in the collective, in the way you all moved as one, blaster fire crackling in perfect rhythm. The instructors began to let you wear practice armor during these sessions, plastoid plates heavy and awkward at first, but soon molding to your body until they felt natural, protective, almost comforting. The first time your visor locked with another's, and you could not tell who was beneath, you realized you were no longer meant to be recognized as an individual, but as a piece of something larger, faceless and eternal. Some recruits cried in the barracks, others whispered of desertion, but more and more you found yourself pushing those doubts aside, silencing them not out of fear, but out of belief, because discipline had taught you that there was no life outside of the Empire's embrace. By the time you graduated from basic drills into advanced squad tactics, your steps no longer belonged to you. They belonged to the formation, to the chant, to the endless march that stretched far beyond the academy walls. And though some part of you still flickered, faint and distant, whispering of the child you once were, the voice was drowned beneath the clatter of boots, the hiss of helmets, and the steady beat of discipline that now carried you forward without pause. By the final phase of your training, discipline was no longer something you reached for, but the air you breathed, and even the instructors, once looming figures of terror, had become little more than the voices of inevitability, their orders flowing through you as naturally as the beat of your heart. Where once you had stumbled on obstacle courses, now your body moved with precision, climbing, crawling, firing, striking in exact rhythm with your squad, every motion timed to the cadence of boots on Duracrete. The Academy stripped away hesitation with simulations that felt like real battles, holograms of rebels rushing your lines, blaster fire that stung when it struck, smoke filling your visor until you could see nothing but outlines in the dark. At first you panicked, but discipline pressed you forward, reminding you that instinct was nothing without order, that survival came from trust in formation, not from the desperate scramble of individuality. Graduation loomed in the distance, whispered about in the barracks, when exhaustion dulled voices to murmurs, and though none of you dared speak of pride aloud, each of you carried it like a secret ember. The first time you marched in full armor under the open sky, sunlight glinting off the plastoid plates, you felt the strange duality of facelessness. You were invisible, and yet you belonged to something that seemed eternal. The helmet that had once felt suffocating now settled over you like a second skin, its hiss of air filters steadying your breath, its visor narrowing your vision until the galaxy itself became simple, targets and comrades, orders and objectives. No questions, no doubts. Nights were shorter, dreams reduced to flashes of drills and voices, and the memory of your childhood room, your parents' faces, the streets of your homeworld all blurred into something distant, something almost fictional. You had become what the Empire desired, not because you were forced, but because you were reshaped, hammered and polished, until even you no longer longed for the freedom of choice. In the stillness before dawn, when you stood in perfect rows with your squad, waiting for orders, you felt the silence settle inside your chest like calm water, and you understood why the Empire called Stormtroopers its shield. Because discipline had erased everything else, and all that remained was the soldier, faceless, nameless, and unyielding. By the time the final weeks of training arrived, you no longer measured yourself by the passing of days, but by the steady rhythm of drills and inspections, for the Academy had dissolved the idea of time into a single unbroken march toward completion. You rose without hesitation, dressed without thought, and moved in step with your squad before the first light reached the horizon, your body and mind bound completely to the cadence that had been carved into you. The instructors who once seemed towering and merciless now regarded you with clipped approval, not because you had become individuals worth praising, but because you had become indistinguishable from one another, perfect reflections of the Empire's design. Combat simulations grew harsher, urban mock-ups filled with smoke and alarms, jungle ranges with hidden targets, frozen fields where the cold gnawed through your armor. But the lessons were always the same. Move as one, shoot as one, survive as one. The first time your squad cleared a training ground without error, the instructors allowed a single brief nod of acknowledgement, and that small gesture felt larger than any speech you had ever heard. Even in exhaustion, you carried it with you, proof that the forging had worked, that you were no longer raw material, but finished iron. The barracks fell quieter, too, not because fear silenced whispers, but because there was little left to say. Memories of home no longer mattered. Questions about the future were swallowed by inevitability, and the only language you truly shared was the unspoken bond of the line. At night, lying beneath the thin blanket, you no longer dreamed of parades or of your family's voices. Instead, you dreamed of formations, of helmets gleaming under distant suns, of orders carried out without flaw. And when you woke, the dream bled seamlessly into reality, for there was no longer a line between the two. By then, you understood what discipline truly meant. It was not obedience forced upon you, but the surrender of self, the willing acceptance that your life no longer belonged to you, that the Empire had shaped you into a vessel of its will. The Academy's walls had done their work, and as graduation loomed, you stood ready to step beyond them, not as a child, not even as a person, but as a stormtrooper, forged and disciplined, faceless and unbroken. Graduation came not with applause or ceremony, but with the quiet, heavy finality of orders delivered. Your designation spoken aloud for the first time as something permanent, a number that replaced the name you had carried since birth. And when the moment arrived, you did not protest, did not even flinch, for by then you had already forgotten the sound of your own name in your ears. You marched with your squad across the courtyard one last time, boots striking in perfect unison as the banners of the Empire fluttered above. And though no family was there to watch, no familiar voices to cheer, you felt a strange swell of pride in the silence, because you knew that you had been remade, that you were no longer a child or a recruit, but a stormtrooper, one part of the endless legion that stretched across the stars. The day of deployment began with a shuttle waiting on the pad, its hull gleaming under the gray light of dawn. And as you filed aboard, you realized you were leaving not just the Academy, but the last fragment of the life you had once known. The shuttle lifted, the ground of training falling away beneath you, and for a brief moment the world seemed endless, the stars opening before you in their quiet eternity, until hyperspace swallowed them into streams of blue light and carried you to the place where your service would truly begin. When the ship emerged, a star destroyer loomed before you, vast and imposing, its dagger-shaped hull blotting out the stars, its countless windows glimmering like watchful eyes. The scale of it staggered you. The Academy had spoken of them, the holovids had shown them, but to see one in truth, to feel the gravity of its presence pressing against you, was to understand how small you were in the machinery of the Empire. Inside, the corridors stretched endlessly, white walls gleaming under sterile lights, stormtroopers marching in ranks, officers striding with datapads in hand, the hum of engines reverberating through durasteel floors like the heartbeat of a giant. You were led to the barracks, rows upon rows of cots identical to the Academy's, lockers marked with designations, helmets resting in perfect lines, as though waiting for the lives they would erase. Days aboard the Star Destroyer settled into a rhythm as relentless as training. Patrols through echoing corridors, inspections by officers whose eyes never softened, drills conducted in the cavernous hangar bays where squads practiced boarding maneuvers again and again until every motion became instinct. The galaxy beyond seemed far away, visible only through the occasional viewport where stars glimmered cold and indifferent. But within the ship, the Empire was all-encompassing, a world of orders, corridors, and discipline. The first deployment came without warning, klaxons echoing through the halls as officers barked commands, squads scrambling into transports, the rush of adrenaline filling your chest as you clutched your blaster rifle and followed your comrades into the belly of a shuttle. The mission was not glorious. It was a suppression, a village accused of harboring rebels, streets filled with frightened civilians as you marched through, the hiss of your helmet distorting their cries until they sounded distant, almost unreal. You held your weapon ready, your boots striking stone, and though no shots were fired, though the operation ended with only arrests and the raising of banners, you understood in that moment the true nature of your role. Not to be honored, not to be thanked, but to be feared. To be a shadow in white armor that bent the galaxy under the Empire's will. And when you returned to the Star Destroyer, when the helmet was set on its stand and the barracks lights dimmed, you lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of silence pressing against you, realizing that the recruiter's promise had not been false but incomplete, for you had been given a place to belong, but it was a place where your face no longer mattered, your voice no longer counted, your life no longer belonged to you. Yet even in that silence, you felt the strange comfort of unity, the certainty that you were part of something vast, that you marched not alone but as one among millions, and that though the galaxy might curse you, the Empire would never forget you, because you were its shield, its weapon, its stormtrooper. Life aboard the Star Destroyer soon settled into a rhythm so unyielding that days blurred together, each one marked less by the passage of time than by the repetition of tasks, the constant hum of engines, the echo of boots on durasteel. You awoke to the blare of lights snapping on, cots creaking as dozens of stormtroopers rose in perfect unison, each of you donning armor polished to the same sheen, helmets locking with the same hiss, blasters lifted with the same mechanical precision. The barracks smelled of oil, plastoid, and recycled air, the odor of soldiers who lived not as individuals, but as extensions of the same machine. Drills filled your mornings, boarding maneuvers practiced in cavernous hangars, firing ranges that glowed with the sparks of red bolts, tactical formations repeated until every step aligned without thought. At first you felt pride in the sharpness of your squad, in the way you moved like a single body. But slowly that pride dulled, replaced by a strange emptiness, for perfection became expectation, and expectation never allowed rest. When not drilling, you patrolled the endless corridors of the destroyer, walking past crew members who avoided your visor's gaze, technicians who bowed their heads as you passed, civilians who glanced at you with fear as though you were less a person than a symbol of what the Empire demanded. Through narrow viewports, you sometimes caught glimpses of the stars, clusters, and nebulas that shimmered in silent indifference, and you wondered, though only in the privacy of thought, what life was like on those distant worlds, for you no longer belonged to any of them. Deployment orders arrived without warning, klaxons screaming through the ship, officers directing squads into transports, adrenaline rushing like fire through your veins. You descended onto desert settlements where heat shimmered off sand and civilians shrank back into doorways, onto forest outposts where shadows swallowed your white armor and every rustle of leaves felt like a threat, onto icy tundras where breath froze in your filters and blaster bolts glowed against snow. Sometimes you fought, exchanging fire with rebels who wore no armor, who shouted to one another in voices raw with desperation. And though your training carried you forward, you could not help but notice how determined they were, how fiercely they fought against soldiers who should have seemed unstoppable. Other times you stood guard as officers barked orders, as arrests were made, as banners were raised over cities that had not asked for them. Each mission blurred into the next, each planet another place that did not belong to you, each assignment another reminder that the galaxy did not see you as savior, but as shadow. And yet, inside the helmet, your own breath steady in your ears, you found a strange calm, because the armor protected you not only from blaster fire, but from the weight of what you saw. You told yourself you were only following orders, only part of the machine, and the machine did not question. It only endured. Still, in the quiet of the barracks after missions, when helmets were set upon racks and the lights dimmed, you sometimes caught fragments of whispers among your squad, memories of home spoken in hushed tones, names uttered that should have been forgotten, fleeting doubts about whether the Empire's cause was truly as pure as the Hollows claimed. No one spoke too loudly. No one risked open rebellion, for the fear of punishment was as sharp as any blaster. But the murmurs lingered like ghosts, shadows of the lives you had all left behind. And though you never joined those whispers, you carried them with you, tucked away like the small token your father had once pressed into your hand. A secret reminder that even in the heart of the Empire's vast machine, humanity still flickered faint and fragile beneath the mask. Occupation was not the glory the recruiter had promised, not the shining march of parades across grateful cities, but a long, weary silence that settled over every street you walked, every doorway you passed, every eye that turned away when your visor faced it. For to live as the hand of the Empire on foreign soil was to carry the burden of being both protector and oppressor, though in truth you were never seen as the former. You arrived in settlements whose names blurred together, places of dust, stone, or steel. Worlds where markets once rang with chatter, but now fell quiet as soon as your boot struck the ground. Patrols stretched endlessly, the same streets walked until their cracks and shadows were etched into memory, Rifles carried not as tools of defense, but as reminders of order, their barrels enough to still the voices of children who had been laughing only moments before. Curfews were enforced with the flick of a chrono. Doors slammed shut as lights dimmed, and you found yourself pacing empty avenues beneath banners the locals had not raised, your own reflection caught faintly in shop windows that no longer dared to display anything but approved symbols. Arrests became routine, not dramatic clashes with armed rebels, but the quiet seizing of figures accused of dissent, sometimes dragged from homes in the night, sometimes lined against walls while their families looked on with eyes full of fear that pierced through even the protection of your helmet. You told yourself it was necessary, that order required vigilance, that the whispers of rebellion were embers that would spread if not stamped out. But in the stillness after such missions, when you returned to the barracks and removed your helmet, you could still feel the weight of those stairs pressing against you, haunting your silence. Occupation demanded endurance not only of the body but of the spirit, for the days stretched long with monotony and the weeks blurred into a haze of repetition. Wake, march, patrol, report, sleep. Civilians passed you with heads bowed, voices lowered, movements careful, and though you longed once to be admired, to be seen as a symbol of strength, you realized quickly that you were feared instead, a faceless enforcer whose presence meant danger rather than safety. Children who once might have gazed at you in wonder now hid behind their mothers, peeking only long enough to catch a glimpse of your armor before ducking away. Even the markets grew colder, vendors forced to smile as you walked by, their gestures stiff, their words hollow, for they had learned that the wrong glance could bring punishment. And yet, for all the weariness it carried, the occupation bound itself around you like a second skin. You became accustomed to the silence that followed your steps, to the way conversations broke off when you entered a square, to the knowledge that your helmet had made you a ghost in their eyes, present powerful, but never truly human. In time, you stopped wondering what they thought, stopped questioning whether they hated you or pitied you, for such questions only led to cracks in discipline. And cracks were dangerous. You told yourself again and again that you were not there to be loved, not there to be thanked, but to keep order, to serve the Empire. And if that meant carrying the weight of their fear, then so be it. Still, in the quiet hours of night patrols, when the streets lay empty and only the hum of distant generators filled the air, you sometimes let your thoughts drift, remembering the child you had been, staring at stormtroopers in parades with awe. And you wondered if those children peeking from doorways saw you the same way, or if all they saw was the cold gleam of armor and the shadow of a rifle. And in those moments when the silence pressed too heavily, you shifted your weight, steadied your grip, and reminded yourself of the one truth that had been carved into you since the academy. You are not meant to be seen, not meant to be remembered. You are only meant to endure, faceless and loyal, the weight of occupation resting forever on your shoulders. As the months of occupation stretched into seasons, the weight grew heavier, not from the armor you wore nor from the rifle that rested constantly against your gloves, but from the silence that followed you wherever you went, for silence can crush more surely than battle, and it became the constant companion of your days. Patrols no longer felt like missions but like rituals, the same streets walked in endless loops, dust collecting on your boots, voices dimming when your shadow passed across doorways, markets quieting as you approached, and every eye trained carefully away from your visor, as though to acknowledge you was to invite danger. At first you told yourself it was proof of your effectiveness, that fear was a form of control, but over time the sameness dulled you, grinding away at the edges of your mind until even fear lost its sharpness, replaced by a weary indifference. Arrests came often, ordered not with ceremony, but with datapads passed down from officers. Names highlighted in glowing red, houses marked by symbols scrawled discreetly on their doors. You learned to knock with the butt of your rifle, to step inside dim homes lit by cheap lamps, to pull men or women from their families, while children clung to legs and sobbed silently. You told yourself it was duty, that the accused had been caught aiding rebels, that each removal prevented violence from sparking. But when the cells filled with faces that looked no different from the neighbors who remained, you stopped asking who they were or what they had done. Sometimes, in the stillness of a night shift, you could still hear the sound of their footsteps echoing in your helmet. The shuffle of resistance and the sobs left behind, haunting the corners of your thoughts even as you tried to bury them beneath the weight of obedience. Curfews were the simplest part of your work, yet they carried their own quiet cruelty. As dusk settled, you and your squad would march through the streets, blasters held at the ready though rarely raised, and watch as shutters closed one by one, lanterns dimmed, conversations ended mid-sentence. The world seemed to hold its breath until morning, as though life itself had been banished from the night. Sometimes you caught glimpses of faces peering from cracks in windows, quick and fearful, but never for long. For even the act of looking carried risk. The emptiness of those curfew nights was different from the silence of patrols. It was heavier, more suffocating, as though the very air disapproved of your presence. You grew used to it, as one grows used to the weight of armor, but somewhere deep inside, you remembered a time when nights had been filled with voices, laughter, and light, and you felt the faint echo of what had been lost. Small uprisings flared occasionally, never enough to shift the balance of control, but always enough to remind you that beneath the surface calm, there burned a fire. Stones were thrown from rooftops, graffiti scrawled in alleys before dawn. Sometimes even blaster shots fired from hidden corners, brief flashes of defiance before being smothered by overwhelming response. Each time, the Empire reacted swiftly, squads deployed to seal off streets, arrests made by the dozen, punishments carried out publicly so all could see the cost of resistance. You stood guard at these displays, armor gleaming under the harsh lights, while officers read charges aloud and citizens watched with hollow eyes. And though you told yourself it was necessary, that order demanded consequences, you could not shake the feeling that you were less protector than executioner, holding the line of a silence that grew deeper with every act. Yet even amid these duties, moments of humanity broke through, fragile and fleeting. A child once dropped a small carved toy in the street as you passed, and though training told you to keep moving, some instinct made you pause, stoop, and hand it back. The child froze, eyes wide with fear, then snatched the toy and vanished, leaving you standing there with the weight of the helmet pressing heavier than usual, realizing that even small gestures were seen not as kindness, but as threats. Another time, during a storm that drenched the city, you and your squad sheltered beneath an archway while civilians hurried past with cloaks pulled tight, and for a brief moment, you felt less like an enforcer and more like one of them, soaked and weary, yet the glance of a passerby reminded you of the gulf that armor had carved, that to them you were never human, only the faceless shape of the Empire. Over weeks that turned into months, you stopped expecting gratitude, stopped waiting for the approving nods you had once dreamed of as a child, and instead you came to understand that your role was not to be admired, but to be endured. The occupation was not glory, it was gravity, a constant pressure that bent the lives of everyone beneath it, including your own. And though you carried out every order, followed every patrol, enforced every curfew, some part of you began to realize that the helmet did not only shield you from them, it also shielded you from yourself, hiding the doubts that threatened to rise, muffling the voice that sometimes whispered in the stillness of night. Was this truly the life you had chosen, or the one chosen for you? The question lingered unanswered as your boots continued to strike stone, as the streets continued to fall silent, as the occupation pressed ever heavier upon your shoulders. War was never what you had imagined as a child staring at parades, never the clean lines of banners and polished armor gleaming in the sunlight, but a blur of chaos where smoke, fire, and fear erased any sense of glory. And you quickly learned why the galaxy called you faceless. Because battles swallowed identity whole, leaving only the white armor that moved through dust and blaster fire like pieces on a game board pushed by unseen hands. Your first true combat came on a desert world where heat shimmered across the horizon and the ground cracked beneath your boots, the sky thick with smoke from bombardments that had begun before dawn. The moment your transport doors opened, sand and ash poured into the cabin, grit stinging your eyes behind the visor, the hiss of the helmet filters struggling against the storm of dust. You leapt onto the ground with your squad, blaster rifle clutched tight, and suddenly the drills of the academy felt like faint echoes, inadequate against the reality of bolts searing past your helmet, of comrades collapsing in bursts of white armor and crimson light. You fired not at faces but at silhouettes darting across the ruins of collapsed structures, figures in patched uniforms, some armed with outdated rifles, others with nothing more than determination in their eyes. The sound was endless, shouts over comms, explosions shaking the ground, the high-pitched whine of blaster fire. And yet, inside your helmet, it felt strangely distant, muffled by the rhythm of your own breath. Hours stretched like days as you advanced through alleys choked with debris, the line of your squad shrinking one by one until designations you had marched with since the academy were reduced to silence, their helmets shattered, their bodies left behind in the dust. There was no time to grieve, no moment to pause, only the relentless order to move forward, to clear another street, to hold another line. When the battle finally quieted, when the smoke thinned and the rebels fled into the hills, you stood among the ruins with your armor scorched and your body trembling. And for the first time you realized that the helmet was not only a shield from the enemy, but a shield from yourself, hiding the horror in your eyes, hiding the truth that you had survived, while so many had not. Yet survival was only the beginning, for the battles continued, each one blurring into the next. On jungle worlds you marched through mud that clung to your armor, insects swarming around your visor as you fired at enemies hidden in the trees, their ambushes sudden and fierce, leaving your squad firing blindly into shadows. On frozen tundras you advanced against winds that howled louder than blaster fire, your breaths frosting against the inside of your visor, bodies falling into the snow where they disappeared almost immediately, white armor vanishing into the endless white of the battlefield. In cities you fought through shattered streets where civilians screamed and fled, rebels blending into crowds, shots fired from windows and rooftops, forcing you to return fire without certainty of who was enemy and who was not. Each battle stripped away more of the illusions you had once carried, teaching you that glory was nothing but a word used in recruitment speeches, that victory was measured not by honor, but by survival, that the Empire did not see you as a hero, but as a unit, a number, a replaceable part in a machine that devoured worlds. You learned to stop asking who you were fighting, to stop wondering what cause the rebels believed in. For such questions only slowed your trigger finger, only made the battles harder to endure. You learned to fire quickly, to follow orders without hesitation, to march over ground littered with bodies without looking down. And though the fear never left you, the pounding heart, the trembling hands, the knowledge that each mission could be your last, the helmet hid it well, turning you into the faceless soldier the Empire demanded, a soldier who fought not for victory or justice, but because that was what you had been made to do. In time, you forgot the details of each battle, forgot the names of the worlds you fought on, forgot even the faces of the comrades you lost, because there were too many, because remembering hurt more than forgetting. All that remained was the rhythm of combat, the hiss of the helmet, the crack of blaster fire, the endless march into battles without faces, battles where you were seen not as human, but as the shadow of an empire that consumed everything it touched. And though you still lived, though you still carried the weight of your rifle and the armor on your shoulders, a part of you had already been buried in those fields of dust, mud, snow, and fire, left behind with the pieces of yourself that the battles had carved away. Over time, the rhythm of combat replaced the rhythm of life itself, each deployment a blur of fire and smoke, each mission erasing another piece of the person you had once been, until you no longer thought of yourself as someone who lived between battles, but as someone who only existed within them. The days between deployments were spent cleaning your armor, repairing blasters, standing in endless drills that repeated motions your body already knew. Yet even those intervals felt like waiting rooms for the next eruption of chaos, the next world to fall under fire. When the alarms rang and you filed into the transports, the silence among your squad was heavy, not with fear anymore, but with resignation, as though each of you knew that one day a seat would remain empty and no one would speak of it again. And so it happened, over and over. Comrades who had once shared rations with you, who had whispered half-forgotten names into the dark of the barracks, fell in bursts of light, their numbers erased from the roster, their bunks stripped clean as though they had never existed. You stopped asking who was missing, stopped waiting for farewells because the cycle became endless. Land, fight, lose, march on. On Volcanic World, you felt the ground tremble beneath your boots as ash rained down. Visibility so poor that you fired at movements you could not even see, the heat searing through armor until it was almost unbearable. On Swamp Worlds, the water rose to your chest, your armor dragging you down as you waded forward, blaster bolts sparking across the surface, rebels vanishing into reeds before you could even take aim. On asteroid outposts, the gravity shifted unpredictably, leaving you stumbling as debris floated, as shots came from every angle, as your squad fired blindly into voids of rock and shadow. In every place, the same truth remained. You were faceless, and your enemies were faceless too. Distant shapes erased by distance and fire, none of them close enough to be human, all of them only silhouettes to be struck down. The longer you served, the more the idea of victory faded into meaninglessness, for victories were only pauses, temporary silences before the next uprising, the next ambush, the next storm of resistance. You began to understand why civilians looked at you with fear rather than admiration, why children hid instead of saluting, because to them you were not a guardian, but a shadow of endless war, a presence that never brought peace, only the pause before conflict rose again. And yet beneath the numbness, you carried the small scars of memory, flashes that returned when you least expected, the sight of a comrade's helmet lying cracked in the snow, the echo of a rebel's scream before silence claimed them, the trembling of your own hands after firing into a crowd where enemy and civilian blurred together. You tried to bury these fragments, tried to hide them beneath the calm hum of discipline, but they clung to you, lingering like echoes in the corners of your mind. Still you marched, still you fired, still you obeyed, because obedience was all that kept you upright, all that kept the weight of the helmet from crushing you completely. And so the battles continued, nameless and endless, until you no longer dreamed of parades or of childhood streets, until the only dream you knew was the one where your boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm. Your blaster fired in endless arcs, and your visor reflected the flames of worlds that had forgotten you before you even left them behind. It began quietly, not with blaster fire or explosions, but with whispers that moved more swiftly than any fleet. Whispers that spread through the barracks like drafts through the cracks of old stone. Whispers that told of uprisings larger than the patrols you crushed, of battles that did not end in silence but in victory for those who dared to fight the Empire. At first you dismissed them as idle talk, rumors carried by smugglers and civilians who always seemed to murmur in corners when you passed. But soon the words reached even the ears of stormtroopers, drifting in with supply reports, overheard from technicians, whispered by pilots who claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. There were stories of a battle on a desert moon, a station destroyed not by accident, but by the hand of rebels, a station so vast it could blot out stars, reduced to nothing in a flash of fire. You had seen the hollows before, endless reels of the Death Star's perfection, the Empire's great weapon, invincible and eternal. To imagine it gone seemed absurd, yet the whispers insisted it was true, that rebels had struck at the heart of Imperial power and lived to tell the tale. The officers called it lies, propaganda meant to stir unrest, and in the mess halls they barked at you to silence any mention of it. But the rumor clung like smoke. Soon it grew with each retelling. A farm boy from a forgotten world had flown through the fire and brought the Empire's might crashing down, guided, some said, by the Force itself. You remembered the Academy lectures, the hollows that called the Jedi traitors long dead, myths erased by the wisdom of the Emperor, and yet the word returned like an ember reigniting in ash. The Jedi, the Force, could they still exist? Some troopers laughed quietly, calling it foolishness, but others held their silence too long. The officers called it lies, propaganda meant to stir unrest, and in the mess halls they barked at you to silence any mention of it. But the rumor clung like smoke. Soon it grew with each retelling. A farm boy from a forgotten world had flown through the fire and brought the Empire's might crashing down, guided, some said, by the Force itself. You remembered the Academy lectures, the hollows that called the Jedi traitors long dead, myths erased by the wisdom of the Emperor, and yet the word returned like an ember reigniting in ash. The Jedi, the Force, could they still exist? Some troopers laughed quietly, calling it foolishness, but others held their silence too long. The officers called it lies, propaganda meant to stir unrest, and in the mess halls They barked at you to silence any mention of it, but the rumor clung like smoke. Soon it grew with each retelling. A farm boy from a forgotten world had flown through the fire and brought the Empire's might crashing down, guided, some said, by the Force itself. You remembered the Academy lectures, the hollows that called the Jedi traitors long dead, myths erased by the wisdom of the Emperor, and yet the word returned like an ember reigniting in ash. The Jedi, the Force, could they still exist? Some troopers laughed quietly, calling it foolishness, but others held their silence too long. Smugglers or civilians, now but by your own thoughts, and you found yourself wondering if the rebellion was more than rumor, if somewhere beyond the stars the fight was already shifting, if the white armor that once symbolized strength had begun to look, even to those who wore it, like the uniform of a crumbling order dot. The more the rumors spread, the harder the officers tried to smother them, yet the very act of suppression only made them grow stronger, as though truth thrived best in darkness. In every briefing hall, commanders barked reminders that the Emperor's will was absolute, that the Death Star's destruction was an accident of sabotage or a fabrication by rebel liars, but the words rang hollow, for you could see it in their eyes, the tightness in their jaws, the quickness with which they changed the subject. Among stormtroopers, the silence became its own kind of confession. No one dared speak openly, yet in the mess halls voices fell quiet whenever someone muttered the word Skywalker, and even without explanation the name carried weight. Civilians became bolder too, their stares lingering longer, their whispers sharper. Once, while patrolling a crowded plaza, you caught the glint of a small emblem being passed from hand to hand, a crude carving of the rebellion's symbol, no larger than a coin. When the officers noticed, they ordered a sweep of arrests, dragging people from their stalls, but the sight of that simple mark, the way it was clutched so carefully before being seized, lingered with you longer than the sound of boots or shouts. On another world, far from the core, you found streets painted in slogans before dawn, messages calling for freedom, voices demanding an end to Imperial rule. By midday, the words were erased, banners replaced, but the paint clung stubbornly to cracks in the walls, a ghost of defiance that could not be completely silenced. The rebellion was becoming more than rumor. It was becoming an idea, one that no blaster could destroy, one that even armor could not protect you from. You began to notice the change in your squad as well. Once, comrades had laughed off resistance as futile, but now they exchanged glances in the barracks when news stories arrived. Fleets gathering in secret, governors overthrown, victories won not with overwhelming might, but with the determination of people who refused to yield. Some troopers grew harsher, clinging to cruelty as a shield, lashing out at civilians as if trying to crush the seed of doubt in themselves. Others grew quiet, retreating into silence so deep it was more dangerous than any word. And you, caught between the discipline carved into you and the whispers echoing all around, felt the ground beneath your loyalty begin to shift. The helmet still hid your face, but it could not hide the questions forming behind it. What if the rebellion was real? What if the Empire could fall? What if the life you had been trained to give away was being spent on a cause already crumbling? Patrols became heavier with tension, orders more brutal, punishments harsher, as though the officers sensed the tide changing and feared it more than the enemy itself. Others grew quiet, retreating into silence so deep it was more dangerous than any word. And you, caught between the discipline carved into you and the whispers echoing all around, felt the ground beneath your loyalty begin to shift. The helmet still hid your face, but it could not hide the questions forming behind it. What if the rebellion was real? What if the Empire could fall? What if the life you had been trained to give away was being spent on a cause already crumbling? Patrols became heavier with tension, orders more brutal, punishments harsher, as though the officers sensed the tide changing and feared it more than the enemy itself. You enforced curfews, you broke up gatherings, you arrested those accused of spreading lies. Yet everywhere you went, the stares of civilians seemed brighter, sharper, filled not only with fear but with defiance. And as days turned into weeks, you realized that the rebellion no longer needed to be proven real to you. It already lived in the way people looked at you, in the way your comrades hesitated, in the way silence was no longer enough to contain what was rising. The rumor had become a presence, an invisible weight pressing against your armor, whispering that the storm you served was not endless, that empires could break, that even the faceless could someday vanish into history. You enforced curfews, you broke up gatherings, you arrested those accused of spreading lies. Yet everywhere you went, the stares of civilians seemed brighter, sharper, filled not only with fear but with defiance. And as days turned into weeks, you realized that the rebellion no longer needed to be proven real to you. It already lived in the way people looked at you, in the way your comrades hesitated, in the way silence was no longer enough to contain what was rising. The rumor had become a presence, an invisible weight pressing against your armor, whispering that the storm you served was not endless, that empires could break, that even the faceless could someday vanish into history. Others grew quiet, retreating into silence so deep it was more dangerous than any word. And you, caught between the discipline carved into you and the whispers echoing all around, felt the ground beneath your loyalty begin to shift. The helmet still hid your face, but it could not hide the questions forming behind it. What if the rebellion was real? What if the Empire could fall? What if the life you had been trained to give away was being spent on a cause already crumbling? Patrols became heavier with tension, orders more brutal, punishments harsher, as though the officers sensed the tide changing and feared it more than the enemy itself. Of the price of resistance. Yet each act of force seemed only to deepen the rebellion's hold, to strengthen its story. And in quiet moments, you wondered if the story itself was stronger than any fleet, for you felt it gnawing even at you, weaving its way into the cracks discipline had left behind. The Empire tried to answer with more control, with speeches declaring that the Emperor himself foresaw every move, that no act of defiance could stand. But you sensed the desperation in the repetition, the way officers demanded louder obedience, as if to drown out their own doubts. Some of your comrades clung to cruelty, finding in brutality a way to silence their own questions. But others grew hollow, their movements mechanical, their eyes empty, as if already preparing for a day when the helmet would no longer protect them from the truth. And you, caught between fear and inevitability, felt the rebellion pressing closer, not as a battle you could see, but as a shadow inside your own chest, whispering that the war was no longer about what was true but about what people believed. And the galaxy, slowly but surely, had begun to believe in something other than the Empire. The end did not come all at once, not in a single moment of collapse, but in a slow unraveling that you felt long before the banners fell. The unraveling of certainty, of fear, of the discipline that had once seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. And though you kept marching, kept obeying, You could sense in every patrol, in every briefing, in every silence that the Empire was no longer eternal, but fragile, fraying at the edges like a cloak too worn to hide its seams. The rumors had already grown into truths, the rebellion no longer a whisper but a force, fleets gathering in numbers that officers could not dismiss, worlds slipping from Imperial grasp, no matter how many boots marched upon their streets. And yet, still you obeyed. Still you rose each morning to the blare of alarms. Still you strapped on armor and locked the helmet over your face. Because obedience had long ago replaced choice, because the weight of discipline held you even as the ground beneath it shifted. Then came the orders that carried you into the forests of Endor, where the air smelled of pine and damp earth instead of smoke and ash, where the canopy above swallowed the sky, leaving you marching through green shadows instead of gray streets. At first it seemed routine, another outpost to guard, another shield to protect, another group of rebels to suppress. But even there, in the rustle of leaves and the watchful eyes of creatures hidden in the undergrowth, you felt the strangeness, the sense that something larger was unfolding beyond the limits of your visor. The Death Star loomed above, a half-completed shadow hanging in orbit, its surface bristling with scaffolds, a reminder of power rebuilt, yet the whispers said it was a trap, that the rebellion would come, that the Emperor himself had foreseen it. You did not know what was true, only that you marched through trees, blaster at the ready, your squad silent, your officers tense. And then it happened, not as order but as chaos, the forest erupting in battle, unlike any you had seen. Rebels rushing from shadows, not only soldiers, but villagers with crude weapons, their courage fueled by something stronger than fear. You fired as trained, bolts searing through branches, comrades falling into the undergrowth, shouts rising on comms. But the tide felt endless, pressing from every side. Machines toppled, armor cracked, discipline shattered beneath the press of numbers and determination. You fought, you stumbled, you rose again. But the lines broke, the shield fell, and in the sky above, the weapon that was to be the Empire's triumph burned brighter than any sun, torn apart in flames that lit the heavens. In that moment, as the ground trembled and the sky split with fire, you felt the weight of the Empire slip from your shoulders, not in triumph, not in relief, but in hollow silence, for you had lived your life as its soldier, and now its promise of eternity was ash. You survived, though many did not, dragging yourself through the undergrowth as the battle thundered on. And when at last the forest fell quiet, when the smoke drifted upward to join the fire in the sky, you realized that you were still alive. But the Empire you had served was not. The end of the Empire was not the end of war, not the end of struggle, but the end of certainty. And as you removed your helmet for the first time in years, feeling the cool forest air on your face, you understood that you were no longer faceless, no longer nameless, no longer bound to a cause that had crumbled. You were only yourself again, small, fragile, and uncertain beneath the vastness of the galaxy, and the silence that followed was heavier than any order, heavier than any armor, heavier than the Empire itself. The days after Endor felt less like survival and more like drifting through the remnants of a dream that had once seemed eternal, but now lay broken in pieces around you. And though your body still bore the weight of armor, though your boots still carried you forward, each step felt hollow, as though the ground beneath you no longer recognized the Empire's march. The forest was strangely quiet once the fires died down, its air heavy with smoke and ash, its undergrowth littered with fragments of white plastoid and blackened metal, reminders of comrades who would never rise again. You moved carefully through it, not in formation but alone, guided not by orders but by instinct, each breath inside the helmet sharp and suffocating until at last you pulled it free and let the damp air touch your face. It felt foreign, wrong, almost shameful to breathe unfiltered, but also liberating, as though the galaxy itself had whispered that you no longer needed to hide behind a visor. Other survivors staggered through the trees, stormtroopers without squads, officers without commands, technicians and gunners from the outpost, but none spoke. There was no rallying, no attempt to form a new line, only the quiet realization that the war they had fought for so long had ended in fire above their heads. When transports did not arrive, when no new orders came through the comms, the truth settled heavily. The chain of command had snapped, the shield had fallen, and the Emperor, whose name had been spoken as eternal, was gone. Whispers confirmed it, killed aboard the Death Star, betrayed by one of his own. The officers denied it, shouted that the Emperor could not die, but their voices trembled and their eyes betrayed them, for even they no longer believed. The civilians in nearby villages emerged cautiously, their faces no longer bent with fear but with wonder, their eyes bright with something stormtroopers had never seen directed at them before: victory. Some spat at you, others simply ignored you, as though you were already relics of a past they no longer feared. Patrols were impossible. The people no longer scattered, and every attempt at command was met with laughter or defiance. Even your comrades seemed uncertain, some clinging desperately to protocol, polishing armor, rehearsing drills in silence as though pretending the Empire still lived, while others stripped off their helmets and tossed them aside, unwilling to wear the mask of an order that had abandoned them. You watched it all, caught between instinct and emptiness, and felt the crushing question rise within you. If the Empire had ended, what was left for those who had given everything to it? The recruiter's promise had carried you from childhood to this moment, and now it was ash, leaving you not a hero, not even a soldier, but only a man or woman adrift, faceless no longer, yet uncertain of the face that remained. The end of the Empire was not a roar, but a silence that settled into your chest like a weight, heavier than any armor, for it left you standing in a galaxy that no longer needed the stormtrooper you had become. The aftermath of the Empire's fall did not arrive as a clean break, not as a single moment when banners were lowered and a new galaxy emerged, but as a long, uncertain unraveling, a twilight stretched thin between what had been and what might come next. And for you, a stormtrooper who had known only orders and formations, it was the most disorienting silence you had ever heard. In the first days after Endor, you wandered with others through the wreckage of the forest, comrades without commanders, squads without structure, clinging to fragments of protocol even as the chain of command dissolved like smoke. Some troopers stripped their armor piece by piece, tossing helmets into the undergrowth as though the sight of white plastoid had become unbearable, while others refused to remove a single plate, standing at attention beside trees and ruined bunkers as though waiting for orders that would never come. The villages nearby grew bold, people emerging from homes with defiant eyes, no longer lowering their voices when stormtroopers passed, no longer stepping aside. They raised banners of rebellion, painted crude symbols on walls, and where once fear had filled the air, now it was laughter that stung sharper than blaster fire. You tried to ignore it, to retreat into the rhythm of patrols, but without orders, without a purpose. Even the act of walking a perimeter felt hollow, meaningless. Ships never came to collect you. Transmissions were silent, and the officers who remained offered little more than broken speeches about regrouping and waiting for the remnant fleet. Nights were the hardest, the barracks too quiet, the bunks filled with restless movements as stormtroopers stared at ceilings they had never expected to see without command. Some spoke of defecting, of throwing down weapons and blending into civilian life. Others swore they would march until the last star burned out, clinging desperately to discipline because it was the only thing they had left. You listened, saying nothing, because you did not know which voice inside you spoke louder, the one that longed to remove the helmet forever, or the one that feared what remained without it. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy shifted visibly around you. Rumors of Imperial remnants gathering elsewhere spread quickly, fleets trying to reform under warlords and admirals, but just as quickly came stories of rebellion victories. Planets celebrating freedom, governors fleeing their posts, and stormtroopers hunted or shunned on worlds where the armor had once meant power. To civilians, you were no longer untouchable, no longer a symbol of order, but a reminder of oppression, and many made their hatred clear in words, in stares, in acts of defiance that would once have been met with arrests, but now passed unanswered. Hunger gnawed at the garrison as supplies dwindled, supply lines broken by the collapse, and for the first time you felt what it meant to live as those you had once patrolled over, waiting in line for rations, uncertain if food would arrive, scavenging when it did not. The irony cut deep. The armor still gleamed, but beneath it you were no different from those who had once feared you. And in those long days, as the galaxy seemed to shift without you, you began to wonder if perhaps the greatest aftermath was not the fall of the Empire itself, but the revelation of how little you had truly been. A number in a machine, faceless and replaceable, now left standing in silence as the galaxy moved on. As the weeks turned into months, the aftermath settled deeper into your bones, not with the sharp sting of battle, but with the slow erosion of certainty, and you realized that survival in peacetime, or something that pretended to be peace, was harder than survival under fire, because in battle you had orders to follow, formations to hold, a purpose to cling to, but in the quiet that followed the fall, there was only the vast emptiness of choice, and you were unprepared for it. The garrison fractured slowly, some troopers leaving in the night, their bunks stripped bare, their armor discarded in neat piles, as if they had shed not just protection, but identity itself. Others clung to protocol with almost religious devotion, still polishing their blasters, still standing in formation at dawn, saluting officers who no longer had fleets or authority, their discipline not loyalty so much as desperation, because to admit the Empire was gone was to admit that their lives had been spent on nothing. You drifted between these extremes, not ready to desert, not ready to pretend, caught in a limbo where each morning you still locked your helmet into place, still marched when asked, but inside you felt the hollowness of it all. When rations finally failed and the supply ships did not return, the discipline cracked further. Some troopers scavenged openly in villages, bartering armor plates for food, while others fled to the forests, taking rifles with them, becoming bandits in everything but name. You watched as your squad dissolved, comrades whose steps had once fallen in perfect rhythm, now scattering like leaves in the wind. each following a path the Academy had never prepared you for. Civilians, once cautious, now strode past you with lifted chins, their voices free, their laughter sharp. And though some spat at you or shouted curses, others ignored you entirely, as though you had already become irrelevant, a relic of a time swept away. That indifference cut deeper than hatred, for hatred at least acknowledged your existence, but indifference reduced you to nothing at all. You began to wander beyond the garrison, helmet tucked under your arm instead of over your head, feeling the strangeness of being seen not as a stormtrooper but as a person again. Though even then most eyes slid past you, uncertain, unwilling to reconcile the face with the armor they had always known. Nights grew longer, filled with dreams where the Empire still lived, dreams where you marched in perfect lines under endless banners, only to wake with the ache of loss pressing harder than hunger. In time, you stopped reporting for drills, stopped pretending the orders mattered, and began to walk the galaxy not as a soldier, but as something in between. A shadow of discipline lingering in your step, a ghost of the storm still clinging to your armor. And though the Empire had ended, though the galaxy moved on without you, the aftermath remained inside you, heavy and unyielding, the question echoing louder than any commander's voice. Who are you when the helmet no longer gives you an answer? The months after Endor stretched into a blur of drifting, for with the Empire's command broken, there were no more rhythms to bind your life, no more alarms to jolt you awake, no more formations to march in, only the long silence of a galaxy trying to decide what to become, and you, a stormtrooper without orders, trying to decide whether you belonged in it at all. You saw fragments of the old order scattered everywhere, officers clinging to scraps of authority in dusty outposts, promising that fleets were regrouping, that the Emperor's vision lived on. Squads that refused to remove their armor, parading through towns where no one saluted, their movements a hollow echo of a power that no longer ruled. But you also saw what came after. Rebels raising their banners in markets, voices of civilians growing bold, children playing in the streets after curfew had been lifted, laughter returning to places where silence had once reigned. You walked through it all, neither feared nor respected, the white of your armor still drawing eyes, but no longer carrying weight. Now it was a costume of defeat, a reminder of chains broken, a uniform that had lost the galaxy's consent. Some comrades became mercenaries, selling their aim to whoever paid. Blasters for hire in skirmishes that had nothing to do with empire or rebellion. Others drifted into crime, bandits in forests or pirates in starships. Their discipline melted into hunger, their armor traded for food or credits. A few tried to melt into civilian life, cutting their hair, changing their names, hiding helmets in closets, but you could see it in their posture, in the way their heads turned too sharply at sudden noises, that the storm never truly left them. You felt the pull of each path, but none felt right, for though you no longer believed in the Empire, discipline still lingered in your bones, the march still echoing in your chest. You carried the helmet with you, sometimes wearing it, sometimes holding it, sometimes staring at your own reflection in its black lenses, as though asking a question you could not answer. What am I now? Nights were the heaviest when you lay under alien skies or in abandoned barracks, staring upward at stars that once had been covered by Imperial banners, and you realized the galaxy no longer had a place carved out for you. It was vast, unclaimed, and your steps were your own for the first time. But choice was heavier than armor, heavier than rifles, heavier even than the Empire's silence, for no one had trained you to live as yourself. And so you walked on, each world a little farther from the one you had been born to serve, each dawn a little less certain, each step an echo of the storm you had once been, until the aftermath was no longer the fall of the Empire, but the long, lonely search for what remained, when obedience could no longer tell you who to be. Life after the helmet was not freedom in the way the recruiters once promised you. Life in the Empire would be, nor was it the liberation you imagined rebels felt when the banners of the Emperor burned, but something quieter, heavier, stranger, like waking from a dream too long and finding that the world outside no longer knew your name. For so many years the helmet had been your face, the filtered hiss of breath your only sound, the narrow visor your only vision, and when at last you set it aside, you felt both naked and unreal, as though without it you might vanish into the air. Civilians looked at you differently now when you walked without the armor, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with anger, but always with a sense of seeing something they had never expected to see, a stormtrooper's human face. You found that you had forgotten how to hold your eyes, how to let expression show, for discipline had taught you to keep your chin steady, your posture rigid, your emotions buried beneath plastoid. And now that nothing covered you, every gesture felt uncertain, as if you were learning to be human again. The galaxy around you moved on quickly. Markets reopened, laughter returned to streets, children chased one another without fear of curfews or patrols, and yet you lingered at the edges, no longer feared as a symbol, but never welcomed either. For to them you would always be part of the shadow that had weighed on their lives. Some of your comrades clung to the armor, unable to part with it, wandering villages still wearing helmets even when the power cells had long died, while others cast theirs into rivers or buried them beneath stones, as though to erase their past with a gesture. You carried yours with you, not on your head, but in your hands, setting it beside you when you slept, staring into its black lenses as though searching for the soldier you had been, as though it might still whisper orders that would tell you how to move through a world without command. Work came sometimes, guarding caravans, escorting traders through dangerous routes, lifting crates in shipyards, but each task felt shallow, a shadow of service without the purpose that had once made you endure. People paid you for your skill with a rifle, but none trusted you. They kept their distance, their thanks muted, their eyes always sharp with the question they never asked aloud. If he once served the Empire, could he turn again? And in their doubt, you felt your own. For though you had taken off the helmet, it still lived inside you, the discipline, the drills, the reflex to obey. At night, under stars that once had been hidden by Star Destroyer hulls, you lay awake and realized that the helmet had not only hidden your face, but had carried your life, had given you a place when nothing else had. Without it, you were not free, not yet. You were unfinished, searching, wandering in silence, carrying the memory of the storm with every step. And though you no longer marched in formation, though you no longer bore the weight of the Empire's voice in your ears, the echo of that march remained, steady, haunting, as if the helmet, even lying silent in your hands, still breathed through you, still asked the question you had yet to answer. Who are you when the storm has passed? The longer you lived without the helmet, the more you realized how deeply it had shaped not just how others saw you, but how you had learned to see yourself. For even after setting it aside, you still turned your head too sharply at sudden sounds, still walked in straight lines with boots falling in unison, still scanned corners and rooftops before entering streets that now belonged to children playing and vendors shouting. You discovered that freedom was not loud but fragile. Fragile in the way laughter sounded after years of silence. Fragile in the way markets filled with color, where once only banners had hung. Fragile in the way people looked at you not with obedience but with hesitation, as though they were unsure whether to treat you as neighbor or shadow. You tried to find work, to make yourself useful in a galaxy no longer bound by the Empire's voice. And though your hands knew rifles better than tools, you carried crates in docks, loaded freighters for merchants who eyed you warily, guarded caravans that traveled dangerous routes where bandits struck in the night. Yet every job ended the same way: a nod of thanks, a bag of credits, and the subtle distance of those who could not forget what you had once been. Some nights you thought of discarding the armor entirely, burying the helmet beneath soil or casting it into the sea, but each time you lifted it in your hands, staring into the blank lenses, you stopped. For though you longed to let it go, you feared losing the only piece of yourself that had ever felt certain. Comrades you had trained beside made their choices quickly. Some melted into crime, turning their discipline into brutality. Others clung to the armor, wandering villages as self-appointed guardians no one had asked for. A few disappeared altogether. Names lost in the sprawl of the galaxy, their past erased by distance and silence. You remained caught in between, a wanderer who did not quite belong to the old order or the new, a figure half shadow, half face. On certain worlds, children pointed at your helmet and whispered about stormtroopers as if they were ghosts from a story, and you realized with a strange ache that you had already become a myth, a warning, a relic of a time slipping quickly into memory. Nights under open skies were the heaviest. Without barracks walls and the constant hum of engines, the stars felt endless, and you found yourself wondering which of them now carried rebel fleets, which now belonged to fragments of the Empire trying to claw themselves back, which might hold nothing but silence. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of marches and orders, only to wake with the quiet truth that there would be no more alarms, no more formations, no more voices shouting numbers in the dawn. You told yourself you were free, but freedom without direction was a weight heavier than armor, and so each day you carried the helmet at your side, not as command, but as reminder, not as identity, but as a question. And though the galaxy began to move on, though civilians rebuilt homes and rebels raised their flags, you continued walking. The stormtrooper who no longer wore a storm, the soldier who no longer had a war, searching through the silence of markets, forests, and starports for an answer to the one truth the Empire had never prepared you for: what life meant after the helmet was gone. The uniform lingered long after the Empire had fallen, not only in the plastoid plates stacked in forgotten lockers, or the helmets buried beneath soil, but in the way the galaxy continued to see you, in the way you continued to see yourself. For though you had set the armor aside, its weight clung invisibly to your shoulders, shaping every glance you gave, every step you took, every silence that followed when you entered a room. To civilians, the uniform was memory, a living reminder of curfews enforced, arrests carried out, patrols that silenced laughter and spread fear across streets. And so when they looked at you, even stripped of your armor, they still saw the shadow of that faceless soldier. Some recoiled, muttering under their breath as they passed. Others stared with defiance, as though daring you to act without the protection of white plates. And a few, strangest of all, approached with hesitant gratitude, remembering moments when a stormtrooper had spared them or held a line against pirates, proof that even within the uniform there had been fragments of humanity. Yet for you, the legacy cut deeper than the eyes of others. It lived inside you, in the habits you could not unlearn. You still sat with your back to walls, still counted exits in every room, still woke at dawn, even when there was no alarm, still cleaned your blaster with ritual care, even when no one asked you to carry it. The Academy had trained obedience into your body, and even without officers, even without command, you found yourself moving as if orders might return at any moment. The uniform had not only erased your face, it had carved your soul into shape, leaving you bound to rhythms long after the drum had stopped. In markets, you caught children pointing at you when they recognized the shape of your discarded armor strapped to your pack, whispering stories of stormtroopers as if you were a ghost from a fading war, and you wondered if this was how history began, not as truth, but as myth, a uniform turned into symbol, stripped of the lives that had once filled it. Among comrades, too, the legacy endured. Those who still wore the armor carried it like defiance, insisting the Empire lived on, while those who abandoned it entirely spoke of it like a curse, ashamed to have ever been inside it. You walked between them, helmet in hand, unable to decide whether to bury it or to keep it. For though it had hidden you, it had also held you together. Nights were the heaviest, when you lay staring at stars and remembered the endless barracks, the marches, the voices chanting the same slogans, and you realized that the uniform had given you not only fear, but belonging, not only silence, but certainty. And so you carried its legacy with you wherever you went, not in armor strapped to your body, but in the way your posture remained straight even among civilians, in the way your voice still clipped each word as if reporting, in the way you struggled to answer when asked who you were. For the answer had once been simple. You were a stormtrooper. Now, without the uniform, you were only the echo of what it had made you, and the question of whether that echo would fade or remain forever became the true weight of the legacy you could never take off. The legacy of the uniform deepened the farther you traveled from Endor, for on every world you set foot upon, the sight of white plastoid meant something different, and yet it always meant something, never nothing, as though the armor itself had become larger than the soldiers who once wore it. On some outer rim planets, villagers treated you with suspicion, their voices sharp and their doors shut tight, for to them stormtroopers were still the enforcers of cruelty who had marched through their homes, dragging neighbors away in the night, enforcing curfews that had silenced generations. To them the uniform was a wound, one that would take years to heal, and even stripped of it, you could feel their stares pierce through your plain clothes, seeing not the man, but the soldier you had been. In other places, strangely, the sight of your discarded armor carried a different weight. Merchants would touch the helmet with reverence. Collectors would offer credits to own even a fragment of white plastoid. And some parents told their children to look closely, to remember what discipline and fear had once looked like, so they would not forget the storm that had passed. You realized then that the uniform had already slipped into history, becoming artifact as much as memory, and though you carried it as a burden, others carried it as symbol. Among your comrades scattered across the galaxy, its legacy split like branches from the same trunk. Some wore it still, wandering as mercenaries or hired guards, insisting it gave them authority even when the Empire's voice was gone. But when you looked closely, you saw the desperation in their posture, as if the armor was not protection but denial, a shell they could not shed for fear of discovering what lay beneath. Others refused even to look at it, selling their pieces for scraps of food, melting the plastoid down to erase its form, or burying helmets beneath stones like grave markers. For you, the uniform lingered in subtler ways, in the way you straightened your spine when civilians approached, in the clipped tone you used without realizing when you spoke, in the way you still scanned every horizon as if searching for enemies that might emerge. Discipline remained even when orders did not, and you came to understand that the uniform had written itself into your bones. The galaxy itself wrestled with its meaning, rebels declaring it the symbol of tyranny, storytellers weaving tales of faceless soldiers whose cruelty seemed inhuman, while smugglers and traders spoke of stormtroopers as the endless tide that once held the galaxy in fear. Children whispered about them at night as though they were monsters or ghosts, and in their whispers you felt a strange pang, for they did not speak of you as a man who had once eaten, laughed, or dreamt. They spoke only of the mask. And yet, in rare moments, you met eyes that told a different story. Farmers recalled stormtroopers who had defended their villages from pirates. Miners remembered patrols that had brought a measure of safety in lawless systems. And once, on a distant moon, an old woman thanked you for simply not pulling the trigger when she had stumbled across your path. The uniform, you realized, could mean both cruelty and protection, both silence and order, and its legacy was too vast to belong to one truth alone. At night, when you set the helmet beside your bedroll, you stared into its dark visor and saw not only your own reflection, but the reflection of all those stories layered together. The fear, the hatred, the small moments of mercy, and you understood that you could never truly leave it behind. Whether worn or discarded, loved or hated, the uniform was your inheritance, a mark carried in the eyes of everyone who saw you, and a shadow you would carry until the end of your days. In the end, it was not on a battlefield that you set the helmet down, nor in the silence of a barracks, nor even in the hands of another, but on a quiet stretch of land beneath stars that had never known the march of the Empire, a place where wind carried no orders and the ground bore no banners. You had carried it with you through deserts and forests, through laughter and silence, through hunger and dreams. Its weight heavier than any armor, because it was not merely plastoid, but memory, not merely protection, but the story of who you had once been. And there, beneath the night sky, you placed it gently on the soil, not burying it, not casting it away, but leaving it open to the air, as though to let it breathe for the first time. The visor caught the starlight, black lenses gleaming softly, and for a moment you saw yourself reflected not as soldier, not as enforcer, but simply as a figure who had walked too long behind a mask. The helmet had been your identity, your shield, your silence, and your prison, and though you had cursed it, though you had longed to escape it, you could not deny that it had carried you this far, that without it you might never have endured. So you let it rest, not as rejection but as farewell, not as burden but as acknowledgement. Around you the galaxy moved on. Children playing in streets no longer patrolled, banners raised not in fear but in hope, voices free where silence once reigned, and you realized that the Stormtrooper was already a story fading into myth, A warning whispered, a relic kept in museums, a memory painted in colors of fear and discipline. You had been part of that story, faceless among millions, and yet, in this small act of setting the last helmet down, you had chosen to step beyond it. The night was quiet, the stars vast, and for the first time in years you breathed without weight, without orders, without the constant hum of discipline in your ears. You were no longer Storm, no longer Trooper, no longer uniform. You were simply a person beneath the stars, fragile and unfinished, yet free enough to walk forward without the mask. And though the helmet would remain gathering dust beneath skies that no longer feared it, its legacy would not define your next step. You turned from it, shoulders lighter, breath steady, and walked into the horizon, where dawn waited unseen, carrying not the burden of a soldier, but the quiet, human truth that life, even after the storm, could still begin again. And yet, as you walked away from it, you found yourself glancing back, for the helmet was not merely an object left on the ground, but a chapter of yourself resting there, a silent witness to all the miles you had marched, the orders you had followed, the faces you had never seen. In its blank visor, you could almost hear the voices of comrades long gone, the rhythm of boots in unison, the clipped tone of commanders barking orders, the steady hiss of breath that had once been your whole world. Leaving it behind did not erase those echoes, but it allowed them to settle, to become memories instead of chains, whispers instead of commands. The galaxy, you realized, would tell its own story of stormtroopers. Some would speak of cruelty, others of discipline, a few of fleeting mercy. But for you, the truth was simpler. The helmet had been both burden and shield, prison and sanctuary, and now, at last, it was only a relic of the storm. You let the night carry that thought away, the stars above as countless as the helmets that had once marched beneath them, and you breathed in the quiet as though it, too, were a gift you had never truly known until now. Perhaps someone would find the helmet one day, pick it up, wonder at the life that had lived inside it. Perhaps it would rust, sink into soil, and vanish into the earth as though it had never existed at all. Either way, it no longer belonged to you. You belonged to the steps ahead, to the roads unmarked by banners, to the dawn that would come without an alarm, to the laughter of strangers who might one day see you not as a soldier, but simply as a man or woman who had endured and remained. For the first time, the question that had haunted you, who are you without the helmet, did not weigh heavy but felt open like a horizon stretching endlessly forward. And with that, you let your shoulders ease, let your breath deepen, and stepped into the quiet of the galaxy, not as Stormtrooper, not as relic, but as someone free enough to dream again.